There was once a neighborhood, nestled quietly on the outskirts of town. A place that people called home. But that was before the accident. The terrible, unspeakable event that erased it from the map. The houses were torn apart, flattened, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The residents, gone. Only an empty plot of land remained, a silent witness to the horror. But the strange thing was, no one ever forgot. Every night, after the sun dipped below the horizon, something inexplicable happened. Light flickered from windows that no longer existed, and sounds, voices, footsteps, the creak of doors, echoed through the air like whispers from the past. No one could explain it. The authorities dismissed it as the tricks of the mind, the lingering memories of a tragic event. But the residents of the nearby town knew better. Something in that place still remained, something that refused to die. And every night, when the darkness swallowed the land, the haunting began anew. Adam stood at the edge of the site, staring out at the once thriving neighborhood that had now been reduced to nothing more than an empty field. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. They said the lights still flickered at night, that you could still hear the echoes of laughter and conversations coming from the air, even though no one lived there anymore. But Adam didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. He wasn't one to give in to idle gossip. That was, until tonight. He had come to take photographs for a local news article, documenting the aftermath of the accident. His camera clicked and whirred as he snapped pictures of the desolate area, the broken foundations, and the rusted remnants of what once was a home. As he wandered the site, a strange chill settled in the air. The sun had long since set, and the darkness crept in faster than usual, thickening around him like a heavy fog. Suddenly, Adam stopped in his tracks. He saw it at the far end of the lot, just beyond the wreckage. The faintest glow flickered in the distance. A light, one of the old street lamps, or what used to be a street lamp, was glowing dimly. He blinked, trying to focus. Was it his eyes playing tricks on him? The wind stirred the debris around him, but the light stayed, pulsing in and out like the heartbeat of something alive. Adam felt a chill run down his spine. He told himself it was just a malfunctioning light, that the electrical wiring hadn't been completely cut off. But as he watched, a strange sound echoed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Adam's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't possible. No one was supposed to be here. No one had lived in this area for months. He turned slowly, his heart pounding, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He scanned the area around him, but there was nothing. Only the wind and the dark silence of the empty houses. Then, without warning, a door creaked open somewhere behind him. Adam spun around, his pulse quickening, but the site was still empty, save for the decaying remnants of the neighborhood. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It was just his imagination, the isolation playing tricks on him. He had been working all day, and he was exhausted. But the sound continued, the unmistakable creak of a door, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Adam's breath quickened as the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing from the darkness that surrounded him. The wind howled, and for a moment, he thought he might have imagined the sound, the creak of a door. But the footsteps, they were real. They were unmistakable. He took a hesitant step forward, his heart pounding against his chest, the camera still hanging from his neck. The glow from the light flickered again, this time a little brighter, almost as if it were beckoning him forward. Almost as if it were beckoning him forward. He couldn't explain it. But something inside him urged him to go closer. As Adam approached, he noticed something strange. The ground around him, once bare and covered in debris, now seemed to be shifting. The dirt and gravel under his feet seemed to move. Small patches of it were displaced, as though something was buried beneath. He stepped forward again, now just a few yards from where the light flickered. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and the wind, which had been howling only moments before, felt deathly still. The faint sound of footsteps continued, but now it was accompanied by the soft sound of murmurs, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. Adam's hand trembled as he raised the camera to his eye, snapping a photo of the flickering light. But as he lowered the camera, he caught something in the corner of his eye. A shadow moved across the ground, fast, like a figure darting from one place to another. His heart skipped a beat. There, standing just beyond the light, was a figure. A man, or what looked like a man. His back was turned, but Adam could see him clearly. The figure was dressed in tattered clothes, his head bowed as though he were looking down, but there was something unnervingly still about him. Adam tried to call out, but no words came. His throat was dry, constricted, as though something was preventing him from speaking. His feet moved on their own, and before he realized it, he was walking toward the figure. The closer he got, the more he could hear the whispers. They weren't words, not exactly, but something deeper, guttural, and distorted, like voices trapped in the walls of a house long abandoned. Then, just as he was about to reach the figure, it turned. Adam froze. The man's face was pale, his eyes black voids with no pupils. His skin was stretched tight across his bones, and his mouth hung open, twisted into an expression of pain or agony. For a moment, they locked eyes, and then the man screamed. The scream shattered the stillness of the night, a high-pitched, blood-curdling cry that seemed to reverberate through the air. Adam stumbled back, his legs weak, and he barely managed to catch himself before falling. The man in front of him remained motionless, but his mouth kept opening and closing, as if he were trying to speak, to say something. Anything, but no sound came. The shadows around Adam seemed to twist and shift, distorting the world around him. The light flickered again, brighter this time, but it wasn't the same light. The glow had taken on a sickly hue, and for a moment, it almost looked like fire. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a windstorm, each voice more frantic than the last. With a gasp, Adam turned away from the figure and began to run. His heart was hammering in his chest, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps were following him now, quick and heavy, each step echoing in the empty air. He didn't dare look back. As he ran, the landscape around him seemed to change. The houses, the ones that were supposed to be gone, began to reappear, materializing out of the fog, standing as they had been before the accident, but there was something wrong about them. The windows were dark, but the faintest flicker of movement could be seen from the corners of his vision. He could hear whispers, muffled voices, coming from inside the walls. Adam's legs burned with the effort of running, but he couldn't stop. The house that had once stood at the end of the street was now standing before him, as though it had never been destroyed. He could see the porch light flickering in the distance, the door ajar, as though someone were waiting for him. He approached the house, his feet moving on their own accord, drawn toward the door. He could feel the weight of something heavy in the air, something watching him, pressing against him. His breath caught as he stepped closer to the house, the air around him thick with the smell of decay and rot. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own, and a cold gust of air rushed out, pushing him forward. The floorboards inside creaked under his weight as he crossed the threshold. Inside, the house was different than he remembered. It was cold, empty, but the furniture, everything, was perfectly intact. There were no signs of damage, no signs of the destruction that had once taken place. But as he stepped further inside, he could hear it. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from upstairs. A chill ran down his spine. Adam's breath caught in his throat as the footsteps grew louder, unmistakably coming from above. He glanced around the room, his pulse racing. The house, his eyes scanned it quickly, was too still. The furniture was undisturbed, but everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that didn't belong to this world, as if they were breathing. He turned toward the staircase. The steps creaked under his feet as he made his way toward the hole, each step echoing in the silence. The whispers from the walls continued to swirl in his mind, indistinct but pressing, urging him to go upstairs, urging him to follow the noise. The darkness at the top of the stairs felt thick, almost liquid, as though the shadows were alive, waiting. Every instinct in Adam's body screamed at him to turn around, to leave this place, but his legs carried him upward, against his will. As he reached the top of the stairs, the air grew colder, and the whispers seemed to intensify. He could feel them at the back of his neck, crawling under his skin, making his hair stand on end. He reached the top and stopped dead in his tracks. The hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. But there, at the far end, a faint light flickered from one of the rooms. The footsteps, they were coming from there, against every fiber of his being. Adam stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath him, but the weight of the air around him seemed to press down harder with each step. The light at the end of the hall flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He approached the room slowly, each step feeling like an eternity. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand, trembling, reached for the doorknob. But before he could turn it, the door creaked open by itself. Inside, the room was bathed in dim light, and at first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A bed, a dresser, a chair by the window, but the air in the room was thick, oppressive, as if it were soaked with memories of something long past. And then he saw it. The figure sitting in the corner of the room, its back to him. It was a woman, her hair hanging in tangled strands over her face, her body shuddering with slow, rhythmic movements. She was rocking back and forth, whispering in a voice so soft, so garbled, that Adam couldn't make out the words. Before he could react, she stopped, her head jerking up. Her eyes were wide, black voids with no pupils, and as they locked onto his, a freezing chill shot through his body. The whispers in the room stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with unnatural speed, she lunged toward him, her arms outstretched, and her mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Adam didn't have time to react. The last thing he heard was the deafening sound of his own heartbeat. As everything went black, Adam awoke with a start, gasping for air, his body drenched in cold sweat. His heart was racing, and he could hear the pounding of it in his ears. The room was dark, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. His surroundings seemed unfamiliar, and the weight of the silence was suffocating. He sat up, disoriented, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had seeped into his bones. As he looked around, he realized he was no longer in the house. He was lying on the floor of an unfamiliar room, one with cracked walls and broken windows. The air was thick with dust, and the floor beneath him felt cold, damp. Where was he? Suddenly, he heard a sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the darkness just beyond the broken door, at the far side of the room. The sound was slow at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, growing closer. Adam's stomach twisted in fear. He tried to move, to stand up, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. The scratching stopped. Then, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a long hallway shrouded in darkness. A single light flickered at the end of the hall, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. He couldn't stay here, but the urge to move forward to understand was stronger than the fear that paralyzed him. Slowly, he forced his body to rise to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. The moment he stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, making him jump. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. They were coming toward him. They were coming toward him. He took a deep breath and began walking, the sound of his own footsteps sounding louder than they should have, reverberating through the empty space. As he walked, the whispers started again, rising from the walls, from the shadows. "Help me." The voice was faint at first, barely a whisper. But it grew louder, more desperate with each step he took. Adam's head spun, his body trembling with fear. The footsteps were getting closer, but it wasn't just one pair. It was like dozens, no, hundreds, of feet moving toward him. He reached the end of the hall, where the flickering light came from a room. With every ounce of strength he had left, Adam pushed the door open. Inside was a scene straight from a nightmare. The room was filled with old, decaying furniture, and in the center of it, a large, cracked mirror hung on the wall. Reflected in the mirror was something that shouldn't have been there. It was a figure. A man, or what looked like a man, standing motionless, staring back at him. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes black pits, and his mouth stretched into a twisted smile. And then the man's reflection moved. Adam's heart froze in his chest. The man's reflection moved, its eyes widening, its smile twisting into something darker, more menacing. For a moment, Adam thought he might be dreaming, that he had somehow slipped into a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. But the cold sweat running down his back told him this was all too real. He couldn't take his eyes off the mirror, unable to look away from the man standing there, smiling at him. The man's reflection wasn't just staring. He was now walking toward the mirror, his feet moving with unnerving precision. Adam's blood ran cold as the figure reached out, its hand pressed against the glass, the same hand that had reached out to him moments ago. Adam stumbled back, his body shuddering with dread. He glanced around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing inward, suffocating him. The mirror was the only thing that remained, its surface reflecting not just the man but something else, something darker. As Adam stepped away, he heard a low, guttural laugh echoing in the room. It came from the mirror, but the sound felt like it was inside his head, reverberating through his skull. The man's reflection was gone, but Adam could still hear the laughter, growing louder, more distorted. He turned toward the door, but before he could move, the light above him flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. For a moment, there was silence, and then the whispering began again. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from within him. Adam's chest tightened, and he clutched his head in his hands, trying to drown out the voices, but they were persistent, clawing at his mind. The whisper grew louder, until it was all he could hear. "Help me! Help me! Help me! Help me!" Adam stumbled forward, his eyes wide in terror, and in the darkness, he could see nothing but the glowing eyes of the reflection staring back at him in the black glass. And then suddenly, the whisper stopped. He stood frozen, the silence deafening. The door to the room suddenly slammed open with a deafening bang. Adam's body jerked in shock as the noise echoed through the hallway. The air felt thick with dread, as though something was watching, waiting. He could feel it, cold fingers brushing against his skin, unseen forces closing in around him. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see what was coming, but his legs moved on their own. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing in the doorway, looking into the dark, long corridor that stretched before him. The house, or whatever it was, seemed endless. The walls, warped and decayed, seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, each crack in the walls whispering the same word over and over. "Help me!" He couldn't take it anymore. He had to escape. He turned, bolting down the hall. But no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps kept pace, following him, just behind. Every turn he made led him deeper into the maze of the house, until the walls closed in and the hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart was pounding in his chest. He was lost. He didn't know where he was anymore, and it felt like the house was alive, shifting and changing around him. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. Adam spun around, confused, but saw no one. The hallway was empty, the silence now more oppressive than ever. Then he heard it. The low creaking of a door opening. It came from the end of the hallway, from the very last room. Adam turned and began walking toward it, the darkness in the room at the end of the hall swallowing him whole. The house had him. There was no escape. As he reached the doorway, he could hear something else, a slow, rhythmic thumping, like the sound of someone or something breathing. Without thinking, Adam stepped inside. The room was dark, only lit by the faintest glimmer of moonlight coming through a crack in the wall. He squinted, trying to make out the shapes in the room. There was a figure in the corner, its back to him. Its form was hunched, twisted, like it had been there for years. Adam could feel the presence of something terrible lurking, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his feet heavy with dread. The figure turned slowly, its eyes wide open. Black voids with no emotion, no humanity. And then it opened its mouth and spoke the only words that mattered. "You're not supposed to be here." Adam's heart skipped a beat as the figure advanced toward him, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. The room seemed to contract, the walls closing in around him, suffocating him. Before he could react, he was surrounded by darkness. The last thing he heard was the chilling laughter from the house, mocking him. As the door slammed shut behind him, Adam's vision blurred as he stumbled backward, his hands reaching out for something, anything to steady him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tightening with panic. The room was closing in, the walls pressing against him as if the very house was alive, hungry for his fear, the laughter. It was still there, echoing through his mind, filling every corner of the room with an unsettling, mocking sound. He tried to scream, to call out, but no words came. His throat was dry, constricted by the oppressive air that surrounded him. The figure, if it could even be called a figure, loomed closer, its body twisted and unnatural. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones, and its eyes were nothing but black voids, pulling him in, swallowing his very soul. "You're not supposed to be here," the voice repeated, this time slower, more deliberate. It wasn't a voice that could belong to a living person. It was a whisper from somewhere deep within the house itself, as though the walls were speaking through it. Adam backed away, his legs shaking, but he couldn't move fast enough. The room, the house, it seemed to stretch on endlessly. No escape, no way out. The more he tried to retreat, the closer the figure came, its twisted limbs jerking with each step. Unnatural, painful to watch. The air grew colder. Adam could see his breath, fogging in front of him as he tried to breathe. The darkness around him seemed to close in, swallowing the light, and all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. And then he heard something else. A sound coming from the corner of the room. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, clearer, a door creaking. Adam's head snapped toward the sound. In the farthest corner of the room, a door stood ajar, the wood groaning as though it had not been opened in years. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was urging him to go to the door. Without thinking, Adam forced his legs to move. He stumbled toward the door, his body moving against his will, each step heavier than the last. The figure in the room didn't follow, but its eyes, those black empty eyes, remained fixed on him, a constant, haunting presence. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. On the other side, there was nothing but darkness. But this time, there was something different. Something that felt alive. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of rot. Adam stepped into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. He spun around, but there was no way out. The walls were closing in again, and the whispers were louder, more insistent, swirling around him. "Help me," the voice came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was inside his head, inside his very soul, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Adam could feel himself sinking. The walls were closing in, the air growing thicker, suffocating him. He couldn't see anything, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers continued to swirl, each one more frantic than the last, until they became a maddening cacophony, all voices speaking at once. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The darkness before him flickered, as if it were being distorted by some unseen force. And then, the faintest light appeared, flickering weakly in the distance. Adam couldn't see what it was, but he felt drawn to it, as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored in this reality. With every ounce of strength he had left, he took a step forward, his feet dragging through the thick air. The whispers continued, but now they were less frantic, almost resigned, as if they were waiting for him to understand something. He reached the light, and as he stepped into it, everything shifted. The room around him changed. The darkness faded, and he found himself standing in what looked like a familiar living room. A place he had seen before. A house, but it wasn't just any house. It was the house from the photographs, the one from before the accident, the one that had been flattened. He could see the furniture in the room. Old, worn, but familiar. The walls were lined with photographs, and the faint smell of old wood and dust filled the air. The place seemed peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. But then he saw it, the mirror on the wall. It was cracked, the glass shattered in a jagged pattern. But there, in the reflection, stood the same twisted figure he had seen before, the same pale face, the same black eyes, and that awful, twisted smile. It was watching him, but now it wasn't just a reflection. It was a part of the room. Adam took a step back, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but its eyes followed him, its smile widening. Then the whispers came again, but this time they were clear. One voice, one word, repeated over and over. "Stay." Adam's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. The house had never been abandoned. It had never been erased. This place, this nightmare, was never meant to be forgotten. And then, in the reflection, the figure moved. It reached out toward him. Antonette. Okay. Adam's breath caught in his throat as the figure in the mirror reached toward him, its skeletal hand stretching with unnatural speed. He took a step back, his heart pounding, but it was too late. The moment he moved, the figure's hand seemed to slip through the glass, as though the mirror had become a doorway into something far darker. His body froze in place, and for a moment, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The air grew even heavier, thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to crawl beneath his skin. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, each thud louder than the last. The whispers returned. This time so loud it felt like they were tearing through his mind, urging him to stay, to accept what was coming. The figure's hand emerged from the mirror fully now, its long fingers curling toward him. Adam's chest tightened with fear as the hand reached for him, its cold, lifeless fingers brushing against his skin. It felt like ice, like something foreign, something wrong, had touched him. And then, a voice, deep, guttural, and ancient, echoed in his mind. "You were always meant to be here." The words were not spoken aloud, but Adam felt them reverberating through his entire body. They weren't just a sentence. They were a truth, a horrible truth. The figure in the mirror was not just some apparition. It was a part of this place, a part of the curse that had claimed the neighborhood, a curse that had been passed down for generations. The room around him seemed to distort, the walls warping, and the air became even colder. The lights flickered, casting twisted shadows on the walls, and the floor seemed to ripple beneath his feet, as though the house was alive, breathing. In that moment, Adam realized what the figure meant. He wasn't just trapped in the house. He was trapped in a cycle, a loop of fate that had claimed others before him, and would claim many more after him. The neighborhood that had been erased wasn't gone. It was simply hidden, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. He tried to run, but his body refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, unable to break free from the force that held him there. The figure was getting closer now, its smile growing wider, its black eyes glimmering with an unsettling knowledge. "This is where you belong," the figure whispered in his mind, its voice now a chorus of countless others, all trapped in the same nightmare. "The cycle continues, and you are a part of it." The figure moved closer, its fingers reaching out to grab Adam, but as it touched his arm, everything shifted. The air turned ice cold, and the walls around him seemed to collapse in on themselves. The ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a dark abyss, a chasm that stretched into nothingness. Adam screamed, but no sound came out. His mouth opened, but all that echoed in his mind was the deafening silence. He couldn't feel his body anymore. He was falling, falling into the abyss, falling into a place that had no end. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the darkness lifted. Adam was back in the neighborhood, standing in the center of what once was the living room, now completely decayed and desolate. The house, or what remained of it, seemed to be crumbling around him, the walls peeling away like layers of old skin. The figures were all around him now, shadowy forms, indistinct and blurred, but he could feel their eyes on him, pressing into his mind. They were the souls of those who had been trapped here before him, and now he was one of them. "You are one of us now," a voice whispered from the darkness. Adam spun around, but the house was gone. All that remained was a field, empty and barren. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, and the air hung heavy with the stench of decay. It was no longer night. It was no longer day. Time had no meaning here. He was no longer in control. He was just another lost soul, wandering the endless cycle, trapped in a place that existed outside of time and space. The whispers continued, calling to him, urging him forward, but he knew there was no escape. The lights flickered in the distance, and the footsteps began again. They were always there, always waiting for the next soul to arrive, to fall into the trap of the Eris neighborhood. Adam walked forward, knowing now that he was a part of the curse, that he would never leave. The house, the neighborhood, they would always be there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next victim to cross its path. And as the door to the house opened, Adam stepped through, his body moving without his control, and the cycle began again.